Imagine spending 10 years hiding your child from the man who never knew he existed, only to become the surgeon fighting to save his life. What happened next changed every truth they believed. You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Dark Romance Stories channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. This content is the property of Dark Romance Stories. Please do not copy or re-upload it in any form. The phone rang at 2:47 in the morning, and Dr. Elena Rossi knew before she answered that the night was about to change everything. She had been awake anyway, sitting at the small kitchen table of her Chicago apartment, grading nothing, drinking coffee she didn't need, listening to the soft breathing of her son through the cracked door of his bedroom. 9 years old, dark hair, sharp cheekbones that had never come from her side of the family. Dante slept the way his father used to, fists closed, jaw set, as if even in sleep he was bracing for a fight he didn't know was coming. She looked at the screen. St. Augustine Trauma Center, her hospital. "Rossi," she answered. "Doctor, we need you in immediately." It was Marisol, the night charge nurse, her voice clipped with the particular tension reserved for VIP traumas. "Multiple GSW, thoracic and abdominal. Patients coding intermittently. Dr. Whitfield is out of the building and Dr. Chen is already in surgery. You're the only trauma surgeon we can reach. I'm 15 minutes out." Elena was already pulling on scrubs over the t-shirt she'd slept in, already dialing her neighbour, Mrs. Alvarez, who had a standing arrangement to come sit with Dante on nights like this. Nights like this happened more often than a normal life should allow, but Elena hadn't wanted a normal life in a long time. She had wanted competence. She had wanted to be so good at saving people that the universe might, eventually, forgive her for the one person she hadn't been able to save. "There's something else," Marisol said, and something in her tone made Elena stop with one shoe on. "What?" "Security's already here. Real security, not ours. Men with earpieces. They came in ahead of the ambulance." "Elena, it's a name. I heard one of the paramedics say it in the bay." "Marisol, I don't have time." "Vitale," Marisol said. "Marco Vitale." Elena's hand went still on the doorframe. 10 years. 10 years since she had heard that name spoken out loud in a room that wasn't a courtroom or a nightmare. 10 years since she had packed one suitcase and a photograph of her brother and driven through the night from Manhattan with a life she hadn't told anyone she was carrying, not even the man who had put it there. "Elena, are you still there?" "I'm coming," Elena said, and her voice did not shake because she had spent a decade teaching it not to. "Tell them to prep OR3. I want full cross-match ready. I want vascular on standby, and I want to know exactly what happened to him." She hung up before Marisol could answer, and for one long moment she stood in the hallway of her apartment, with her hand pressed flat against her chest, as if she could hold her own heart in place by force. Then she looked at the closed door of her son's room. 9 years old, she thought. 9 years, and he still doesn't know his father's name. She grabbed her keys and walked out into the rain. The drive to St. Augustine took 11 minutes. Elena used every one of them to build the wall back up, brick by brick. The wall she had spent 10 years constructing between the woman she used to be, reckless, in love, 24 years old and drunk on a man who owned half of Manhattan's underworld, and the woman she had become. Doctor. Elena Rossi, Chief of Trauma Surgery, a woman who did not flinch, did not shake, did not remember. She had been so careful. She had changed her name back to her mother's maiden name. She had left New York for Chicago and never looked back, never Googled him, never let herself wonder if he'd married, if he'd had other children, if he ever thought about the woman who vanished from his penthouse with nothing but a note that said, "I know what you did. Don't look for me." He had never looked for her, or if he hadn't found her. Either way, the silence had been its own kind of answer, confirming everything she believed, that Marco Vitale had ordered her brother's death, that he had chosen power over the woman he claimed to love, and that whatever they had been to each other had died the same night Sal Rossi bled out on a warehouse floor in Red Hook. She parked in the physician's lot and ran through the rain to the emergency entrance, badge already in hand. The bay doors slid open onto chaos. Two men in dark suits stood at either side of the trauma room, hands clasped in front of them, eyes scanning every face that passed, with the flat, professional menace of men who had killed before and would again, if given a reason. A third man, older, silver at the temples, a scar bisecting one eyebrow, stepped directly into her path. "You're the surgeon?" "I'm the surgeon on call. Move." "You need to know who's in there before you—" "I know exactly who's in there," Elena said, and something in her voice made the man step back. "Now get out of my way before he dies while you're making introductions." She pushed past him into the trauma bay, and the world she had spent 10 years running from opened up in front of her like a wound. Marco Vitale lay on the gurney, stripped to the waist, blood soaking through the pressure dressings the paramedics had applied, his face grey under the fluorescent lights, his eyes closed. He looked older. There were lines at the corners of his eyes that hadn't been there a decade ago, a thin white scar along his jaw that told its own story. But it was him. It was unmistakably him, the same hard, beautiful face that had haunted every quiet moment of the last 10 years, the face their son wore every time he frowned in concentration over his homework. "BP's dropping, 80 over palp," a resident called out. "We're losing him." Elena's training took over before her heart could interfere. "Get me 2 units O-neg, wide open," she said, already snapping on gloves, already moving to the head of the table, already the surgeon and nothing else. "Someone page anesthesia. We're going to the OR now. Move, people, move!" And then his eyes opened. For one terrible, suspended second, Marco Vitale looked up into the face of the woman he had spent 10 years searching for, and Elena watched the recognition hit him like a second bullet. "Elena," he said, his voice a broken rasp. And then, before the anesthesiologist's mask covered his mouth, before his eyes rolled back and his heart monitor screamed its warning, "You're real." His heart stopped twice on the table. The first time, Elena's hands didn't shake. She called the code, called for the paddles, called the rhythm back into a chest she had once fallen asleep against, with the mechanical precision of a woman performing a task she had done 100 times before, because if she let herself think about whose chest it was, she would fall apart, and Marco Vitale would die on her table, and she would spend the rest of her life wondering if some small, cruel, unhealed part of her had let him. "Charging to 200, she said. "Clear." His body arched. The monitor screamed its flat single note, then, blessedly, mercifully, found its rhythm again. "We've got him. Sinus TAC 110. Let's move." The second time she was already inside him, her hands buried in the wreckage of his abdomen, working to repair a lacerated liver and a nicked splenic artery, while a resident held retractors and a scrub nurse handed her instruments before she asked for them, because everyone in that room could feel that the woman at the table had gone somewhere very far away inside herself and was operating on pure muscle memory and rage. "He's crashing again," the anesthesiologist said. "Pressure's in the toilet." "I know," Elena said, and for the first time in 10 years she let herself say his name out loud in a room full of strangers. "Marco, you do not get to die on me. Not now. Not after 10 years. Not like this." She found the bleeder. She clamped it. She watched his pressure climb back into something survivable, and somewhere in the controlled chaos of the next 40 minutes, Dr. Elena Rossi stopped being a woman with a decade-old wound and became, simply, the best trauma surgeon in the city of Chicago, doing the only thing she had ever been able to do about the men she couldn't save: fight for the ones still on the table. By the time she closed, dawn was starting to bleed grey light through the high windows of the OR, and Marco Vitale was alive, stable, and sedated in the ICU, 3 tubes and a ventilator standing between him and the life he had almost lost. Elena stripped off her gloves in the scrub room and stood over the sink for a long moment, staring at her own reflection in the dark window, before her hands finally began to shake. "You should sit down," said Dr. Chen, appearing beside her with 2 cups of terrible hospital coffee. He'd come out of his own surgery an hour ago and had clearly heard, by the particular hush that moves through a hospital when something enormous has happened, exactly whose life had just been saved in OR3. "That was... Eleanor. That was one of the best resuscitations I've seen in 15 years. You want to tell me how you knew the name of a patient who came in unidentified?" "I didn't know him," Eleanor lied, taking the coffee because her hands needed something to hold. "I know of him." "Everybody in Illinois knows of Marco Vitale," Chen said dryly. "It's knowing him personally that tends to get people killed." Eleanor said nothing. She drank the terrible coffee and let her friend believe whatever version of the truth was easiest. Because the real one... I loved him for 2 years. I ran from him for 10, and the boy sleeping in my apartment right now has his eyes. Was not a story she was ready to tell anyone, least of all herself, standing in the wreckage of a night she had never planned for. "He's asking for you," a nurse said, poking her head into the scrub room. "He's semi-conscious, in and out, but every time he surfaces, he says your name." Elena closed her eyes. "Tell him I'll be by on rounds," she said, and did not move for the ICU. Not yet, because she needed 10 more minutes to remember how to be a stranger to a man who had once known every inch of her. She found the 10 minutes. She did not find peace. When she finally walked into the ICU room, private, guarded, 2 of the men in dark suits posted just outside the door like sentries at the gates of something, Marco was awake, grey-faced and hollowed out by blood loss, tubes taped to the back of one hand, but awake, and his eyes found her the instant she crossed the threshold, as if some part of him had been tracking her position in the building the entire time. "You're not a hallucination," he said. His voice was wrecked from the ventilator tube, low and rough, but the intensity underneath it was exactly as she remembered, that terrible, focused attention that had once made her feel like the only person alive in a room of 100 people, and that now made her feel like prey. I'm your surgeon, Eleanor said, keeping her voice clinical, professional, 100 miles from the woman she'd been at 24. She picked up his chart, more to have something to look at than because she needed the information. You suffered 2 gunshot wounds, one nicked your liver, the other your spleen. You lost a significant amount of blood, and your heart stopped twice on my table. You are extremely lucky to be alive, Mr. Vitale. Marco, he said. You don't have to pretend you don't know my name, Elena. You screamed it at me while I was dying. Her jaw tightened. That was a professional reflex. Was it? It wasn't a question. His eyes moved over her face with an intensity that made her skin prickle, cataloguing every change 10 years had made, the small lines she hadn't had before, the way she held herself now, guarded, closed, nothing like the girl who used to fall asleep in his arms in a penthouse 40 floors above Fifth Avenue. You cut your hair. A lot has changed. Not everything. His hand, the one not tethered to an IV, moved half an inch toward her before he seemed to catch himself, to remember, perhaps, exactly how she had left him and exactly why she had every right to hate him. His hand fell back to the blanket. I looked for you, Elena, for years. I need you to know that. I don't want to know that, Elena said, and the words came out sharper than she meant them to, sharper than a doctor should ever speak to a patient, but she couldn't stop them. I want to know that your vitals are stable and that you're going to survive the next 48 hours, and then I want to hand your care off to another physician and never see you again. Something in his face went very still. You still think I did it? Elena's hand tightened on the chart until the metal clip bit into her palm. I don't think, Marco. I know. I was there. I saw what your family did to my brother. You don't get to lie in a hospital bed and rewrite 10 years of history because you almost died and it's made you sentimental. I never lied to you, Marco said, and for the first time his voice cracked, not from weakness, but from something that looked, terribly, like grief. I have spent 10 years trying to find you to tell you the truth, and you have spent 10 years running from a version of me that never existed. I did not kill Sal. I tried to save him. I was 3 minutes too late, Eleanor, and it has haunted me every single day since. Eleanor stood very still, the chart clutched against her chest like a shield, and told herself she did not believe him. Told herself the way her heart had just cracked down the middle was pain, not hope. Told herself that 10 years of certainty could not be undone by a dying man's fever dream confession. Get some rest, she said instead, and walked out of the room before he could see her hands were shaking again. She didn't sleep when she got home. She sat on the edge of Dante's bed and watched him breathe, the way she had done nearly every night for the first 2 years of his life. Back when she'd been so afraid the past would reach across state lines and take him too. 10 years ago, she had been a third-year surgical resident at a hospital in Manhattan, 24 years old, brilliant and reckless in the way only the truly gifted allow themselves to be. When Marco Vitale walked into her ER with a gunshot wound to the shoulder and a silence around him so absolute that even the nurses stopped talking when he passed. She had not known who he was. That had been the strange grace of it. She had treated him the way she treated everyone, with sharp hands and sharper words, telling the terrifying, beautiful stranger to stop being a baby about a little local anesthetic while she dug a bullet out of his trapezius. He had laughed. It had been, she would learn much later, an extraordinarily rare sound. He had come back 3 days later with flowers. and a story about needing a follow-up he clearly did not need. And Elena, who had never in her life met a man who looked at her like she was the only fixed point in a spinning world, had let herself fall. It had taken her 4 months to learn what he was. By then it was too late. She loved him too completely to let a surname change anything. Marco Vitale, heir to one of the 5 families that had for 80 years controlled the ports, the unions, the shadow economy of the eastern seaboard. Cold to everyone but her. Feared by men who feared nothing else, and utterly, dangerously obsessed with her, in a way that had felt, at 24, like the greatest love story of her life. Her brother Sal had hated it from the start. Sal, 3 years older, a beat cop working narcotics, had begged her to leave Marco a dozen times. "You don't understand what these people are, Lena. You think love changes what he is? It doesn't. It just means you'll be standing next to him when it catches up to both of you." She hadn't listened. And then, on a February night 2 years into their relationship, Sal had gone to a warehouse in Red Hook to meet a confidential informant about a case he'd been building against a rival family for 18 months. A case, she would later learn, that had accidentally exposed a leak inside Marco's own organisation, and he had never come home. She remembered the phone call. She remembered the morgue. She remembered, most of all, standing in Marco's penthouse 3 days later, hollowed out with grief, when his consigliere, Dominic, had let slip, in a moment of drunken carelessness, that the hit had come from inside the family, that someone close to Marco had ordered it. She hadn't waited to hear more. She hadn't asked Marco directly. She had looked at the man she loved, seen only the family crest stitched into every corner of his life, and run, certain that whether Marco had pulled the trigger himself or simply allowed it, the blood on Sal's hands was, by extension, blood on his. 3 weeks later, in a motel outside Pittsburgh, she had discovered she was pregnant. She had never told him. Not out of cruelty, though for a long time she told herself it was cruelty he deserved, but out of a terror so complete it had rewired her entire nervous system. The terror that if Marco Vitale knew he had a son, that son would never, for one single day of his life, be safe from the world Marco lived in. Now, sitting on the edge of her son's bed 10 years later, watching him sleep with his father's jaw and his father's stillness, Eleanor pressed her palm flat against her chest and tried to breathe through the possibility that had cracked open in that ICU room tonight. I did not kill Sal. I tried to save him. I was 3 minutes too late. What if it was true? What had she built her entire adult life on, if it was true? Dante stirred, murmured something in his sleep, and turned over. Elena reached out and smoothed his hair back from his forehead the way she had done 10,000 times before, and made herself a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. She would find out the truth. Not for herself, for him. Because a boy deserved to know someday exactly who his father was, hero or monster, and Elena was done deciding that answer based on grief instead of facts. At the hospital the next morning, Marco Vitale's private room had transformed overnight into something closer to a fortress. 6 men now stood watch in rotating shifts along the ICU corridor, and the hospital's administrator, a nervous, ambitious man named Whitcomb, had personally come to Elena's office to inform her, with obvious discomfort, that certain accommodations had been made for the patient's security detail, and that she was to be his primary attending for the duration of his recovery. That's not how we assign care, Elena said flatly. It is today, Whitcomb said, not meeting her eyes. The family made a substantial donation to the trauma wing this morning, $500,000. They specifically requested you remain his attending physician. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. He asked for me by name. I believe so, yes. She thought about refusing. She thought about the 20 different ways she could extract herself from this situation, claim a conflict of interest, request a transfer, call in favours from colleagues who owed her. She thought about Dante, asleep at Mrs. Alvarez's house right now, safe, unaware, his whole existence a secret she had guarded for 9 years, like the last coal of a dying fire. And then she thought about the look on Marco's face when he'd said, "I did not kill Sal." And she understood, with a clarity that frightened her, that she was not going to walk away from this. Not because the hospital was making her stay, because some deeply buried, 10 years starved part of her needed to know the truth more than she needed to protect herself from it. "Fine," she said. "I'll be his attending. But I want a written agreement that his security stays outside patient areas, and I want to be very clear, Mr. Whitcomb, that I am treating this man as a patient, nothing more." Whitcomb nodded quickly, relieved, and left her office at something close to a jog. Elena sat alone for a long moment, staring at the framed photograph on her desk. Dante, at 7, gap-toothed, laughing on a beach in Michigan, the only vacation they'd ever taken together, and whispered to the empty room the thing she couldn't say to anyone else yet. "I'm not ready for this." But readiness, she was learning, had never once in her life waited for her permission. By the 3rd day, Marco was off the ventilator, off the worst of the sedation, and dangerous in an entirely new way. Alert, watching, and patient, as a man who had spent 38 years learning that patience was the sharpest weapon he owned. Elena made her rounds at 7 each morning, a small parade of residents trailing her through the ICU, and every morning Marco's eyes tracked her from the moment she entered the room until the moment she left, with an intensity none of her residents were foolish enough to comment on. "Vitals look good," she said on the 3rd morning, reading his chart aloud in the flat, efficient tone she used for every patient, refusing to let it soften even a fraction for him. "Liver enzymes are trending down. We'll reassess the drain output this afternoon, and if it continues to improve, we can talk about stepping you down to a regular floor by the weekend." "Send the residents out," Marco said. "Excuse me? I'd like to speak with my doctor alone." His voice was quiet, but it carried the particular authority of a man who had never in his life had to ask twice for anything, and Elena watched her 2 residents glance nervously between her and the patient, clearly torn between hospital protocol and the very reasonable instinct not to disobey Marco Vitali. "Dr. Osse, doctor. Park, please continue rounds without me. I'll catch up," Elena said, keeping her voice level, refusing to give Marco the satisfaction of watching her scramble to reassert control in front of an audience. The residents left, the door clicked shut, and for the first time in 10 years, Elena Rossi was alone in a room with the father of her child. "You look tired," Marco said. "I'm a surgeon. Tired is the job description." "That's not what I mean." His eyes moved over her face again with that terrible, careful attention. Cataloguing. "You look like someone who hasn't slept properly in 10 years. I know the feeling." "Don't," Elena said. "Don't do the thing where you pretend we're the same kind of wounded. You built an empire on other people's blood, Marco. I built a career trying to save people from men like you. Something flickered behind his eyes, not anger, which she'd expected, but something closer to pain. You still think that's what I am? A man who trades in other people's blood for sport? Isn't it? I inherited a family, Marco said, and his voice had gone very low, very controlled, the voice of a man choosing every word like he was diffusing something. I did not choose the world I was born into, any more than you chose to be born into a house with a father who worked the docks. But I have spent my entire adult life trying to keep the worst of that world away from the people I love. I failed once, with your brother. I have never stopped paying for that failure. Elena's hands tightened around the chart. Then tell me what happened. Tell me exactly what happened that night, Marco, because for 10 years I've built my entire life around one version of that story, and if you're telling me it's wrong, I need more than a hospital bed confession to believe you. Marco was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had the flat, careful cadence of a man reciting something he had gone over 10,000 times in his own head, alone, in the dark, for a decade. Your brother was building a case against the Moretti family. Racketeering, narcotics trafficking through the ports, work that would have taken down half their operation. He'd developed a source inside their organization, someone feeding him information. He didn't know, he couldn't have known, that his source was also feeding information back to Salvatore Moretti, playing both sides. Marco's jaw tightened. Salvatore found out your brother was close to exposing a shipment that would have implicated my family too. We shared certain arrangements with the docks. He decided the fastest way to bury the whole investigation was to bury the cop running it. You're telling me the Morettis killed Sal, not you. I'm telling you I found out 4 hours before it happened. One of my men overheard Salvatore's plans. I drove to that warehouse myself, Elena. I had 6 men with me. We were 3 minutes late. His voice cracked, finally, on the last word, and Elena watched something break open in the face of the coldest man she had ever known. I held your brother while he died. I promised him I would find out who did it, and I would make them pay. And then I promised myself I would never, ever tell you what I'd seen. Because I thought, God help me, I thought it would break you completely, and I thought I could protect you from it instead by simply finding the men responsible and making them disappear. Elena's whole body had gone cold. Dominic told me it came from inside your family. Dominic told you what he believed at the time, before we had confirmation. And by the time we did have confirmation, you were already gone. Marco's eyes found hers, and there was nothing cold in them now, nothing controlled, only 10 years of grief laid bare on a hospital bed. I looked for you for 3 years, Elena. I hired the best people money could buy, and then you simply stopped existing. New name, new state, new life. I told myself you'd found peace somewhere, and that the kindest thing I could do was let you keep it, even though it was killing me. The chart slipped from Elena's fingers and clattered to the floor. Because if this was true, if every word of it was true, then she had spent 10 years hating a man for a crime he hadn't committed. She had run from the one person who might have actually helped her survive her brother's death, instead of surviving it alone. and she had raised his son in secret for 9 years, believing she was protecting him from a monster who, it turned out, might never have existed at all. "I need to go," she said, her voice unsteady for the first time in years. "Elena, I need to think." She bent, retrieved the chart with hands that would not stop shaking, and walked to the door before she turned back, one last time, driven by an instinct she didn't fully understand. "Did you ever find out who they used? Who actually pulled the trigger?" Marco's face went very still. "A soldier named Enzo Ricci, Salvatore Moretti's man. He died 2 years later in a prison fight before we ever got to him ourselves." Elena nodded once, mechanically, and left the room, and did not let herself cry until she was locked inside a supply closet 3 floors away, both hands pressed over her mouth to keep the sound from escaping. It happened on a Tuesday, the way small catastrophes often do, without warning, in the middle of an ordinary hour. Elena had left her phone on the visitor's chair beside Marco's bed during evening rounds, distracted by a page from the ER about a trauma incoming, and had rushed out without thinking twice about it. She was gone 11 minutes. It was long enough. Marco, restless with the particular boredom of a powerful man confined to a bed, had reached for the phone out of nothing more than habit, the reflex of a man who had spent his entire life gathering information before anyone could use it against him, intending only to check the time. But the screen had lit up with a text notification, and beneath it the lock screen photograph glowed in the dim hospital light. A boy, maybe 8 or 9, dark-haired, grinning at the camera, with a gap where a tooth should have been, his arms slung around Elena's shoulders on a beach somewhere with grey water behind them. Marco stared at the photograph for a long time. He told himself at first that it was nothing. A nephew, a friend's child, the kind of photograph any woman might keep as her lock screen. But something in his chest had gone very still and very cold. The particular stillness that had made men twice his size step back from him in boardrooms for 20 years. Because the boy in the photograph had a jaw Marco recognized every morning in his own shaving mirror. The boy in the photograph had his mother's eyes and his father's stillness. And something in Marco Vitale, something buried under a decade of grief and control, began, very quietly, to scream. He did the math without wanting to. 10 years since Elena left. The boy looked 8, 9 at the most. When Elena came back into the room, phone forgotten entirely, she found Marco sitting up in his hospital bed, her phone held loosely in one hand, and an expression on his face she had never once seen there in 2 years of loving him. Not in the ER, not in the penthouse, not even holding a gun. He looked, for the first time in his life, completely undone. "Elena," he said very quietly, "who is this boy?" Her whole body went cold. "Give me my phone," she said. "Who is this boy?" Marco said again, and his voice had dropped into something low and dangerous, a register she remembered from exactly one other context, the handful of times she had seen him deal with men who had betrayed him. "Elena, look at me and tell me who this child is." "That's not your business." "He has my face." Marco's hand tightened around the phone until she genuinely thought he might crack the screen. He has my jaw, Eleanor, my mother's eyes. He is sitting on a beach, wearing my grandfather's watch face in miniature, stamped onto every feature he owns. And you are going to stand there and tell me it is not my business? Marco. How old is he? It wasn't a question anymore. It was a demand. And beneath the demand, underneath the fury that had started to build in his chest like a slow gathering storm, Eleanor could hear something else entirely. Hope. Terrible and raw, and 10 years starved. Eleanor closed the door of the room with a shaking hand, because whatever was about to happen, it could not happen with an audience of nurses and security men in the hallway. "His name is Dante," she said, and her voice broke on the second word. "He's 9 years old. He was born 8 months after I left New York." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Eleanor had ever heard. Marco set the phone down very carefully on the blanket, as if he no longer trusted his own hands, and when he looked up at her, his eyes were wet in a way she had never seen in 10 years of knowing this man, not even holding her brother's memory, not even bleeding out on her table 3 days ago. "9 years," he said. "You have kept my son from me for 9 years. I kept him safe. Safe from what? From me?" His voice cracked. "Do you understand what you did? Do you understand that I spent 3 years of my life turning over every rock in this country trying to find you? And the entire time you were carrying my child, raising my child. And you let me believe I had lost everything when I had a son I never knew existed. I believed you killed my brother." The words tore out of her, 10 years of grief and rage finally finding a target. "I believed the man I loved had my own family's blood on his hands, and I was terrified. Do you understand? Terrified, Marco, that if the Vitali family knew I was carrying a son, they would use him as a weapon, as a hostage, as a pawn in whatever war you were fighting. I ran to protect him from your world because I didn't know, I couldn't know, that you weren't the monster I thought you were." "So you decided," Marco said, his voice shaking now with a fury so controlled it was almost worse than shouting, "that the solution to protecting him from danger was to erase his father entirely, to let him grow up without a single person on this earth who would have laid down his life for him without a second's hesitation." "I laid down my life for him. Every single day for 9 years, I have been the only person standing between that boy and every hard thing in this world. And I did it alone, Marco, completely alone, because I believed the alternative was worse." They stood there, 3 feet apart, both of them shaking. 10 years of grief and rage and love and loss finally spilling out into the antiseptic quiet of a hospital room, and neither of them heard the door open. "Dr. Rossi?" A nurse stood in the doorway, eyes wide, having clearly caught the tail end of a conversation neither of them had meant for an audience. "I'm so sorry. The patient in Bay 4 needs you immediately." Elena wiped her face with the back of her hand, forced her voice into something resembling professional composure, and did not look at Marco again before she left the room. But she heard him, just before the door closed, say one final thing in a voice that would haunt her for the rest of the week. "I am going to meet my son, Elena. That is not a request." She didn't go home that night. She sat in the hospital's chapel, a small, non-denominational room with a single stained glass window and rows of empty pews, for 2 hours, trying to figure out how to explain to a 9-year-old boy that the father he had never asked about, the father whose absence she had always deflected with vague half-truths about a man who wasn't in the picture, was in fact one of the most powerful and feared men on the eastern seaboard, currently recovering from gunshot wounds 3 floors above her, and had just discovered his existence by accident on a hospital bed. She thought about running. The thought arrived with the same old familiar shame it always had. The shame of a woman who had built her entire adult identity around never running from anything except this one thing, this one man, this one truth she had been outrunning for a decade. She did not run. Instead, she called Mrs. Alvarez, told her she'd be a little later than usual, and sat in the chapel a while longer, composing and discarding 100 different versions of a conversation she had dreaded having for 9 years. When she finally went home near midnight, Dante was asleep, and she stood in his doorway the way she always did, watching him breathe, and made a decision that felt less like a choice and more like the closing of a very old wound. Tomorrow, she thought. I'll tell him tomorrow. Marco did not sleep either. He lay in the hospital bed with his son's photograph burned into the back of his eyelids and turned over 10 years of his life, looking for every place he might have found her sooner, every private investigator he'd fired for incompetence when perhaps they'd simply been outmatched by a woman determined never to be found. He thought about every birthday he had missed without knowing there was a birthday to miss, every first day of school, every scraped knee, every lost tooth, every night terror. 9 years of a child's life, gone, unrecoverable, stolen from him, not by an enemy with a gun, but by the woman he had never stopped loving, acting out of a fear he understood, but could not, in the raw wound of the moment, entirely forgive. And beneath the fury, something else moved in him, something he recognized as dangerous precisely because it was so familiar. The particular, focused obsession that had once made him rearrange his entire life around a 24-year-old surgical resident with sharp hands and a sharper tongue. He had never stopped loving Elena Rossi. 10 years of silence had not dimmed it. If anything, 10 years of silence had let it calcify into something harder and more absolute. And now that she was standing in front of him again, real, unchanged in all the ways that mattered, he felt the old obsession reignite with a force that frightened even him. He wanted her back. He wanted his son. And Marco Vitale had never, in 38 years, wanted something he did not eventually take. He picked up his phone, his own phone, retrieved from his personal effects by Dominic that afternoon, and dialed a number he hadn't used in 10 years. "Boss," Dominic answered, still, after everything, using the old title out of habit. "You should be resting." "Get me everything on Dr. Elena Rossi," Marco said. "Everything. Where she lives, where she works, who she trusts, who watches her son when she's on call." And Dominic, quietly, "I don't want a single person outside this room to know I'm asking." There was a pause on the line. "Boss, if I may, this is the thing that nearly destroyed you once already." "I have a son," Marco said, and his voice, even to his own ears, sounded like a man discovering religion. "I have a 9-year-old son, Dominic, and I am done being a stranger to my own family." Get me the information. Tonight. The next morning, Elena arrived at the hospital an hour before her shift and went straight to Marco's room, where she found him already dressed in street clothes someone had brought him, sitting on the edge of the bed against every rule of post-operative care, arguing quietly but forcefully with Dominic about being discharged early. "You are not leaving this hospital," Elena said flatly, stepping into the room. "You have a drain in your abdomen and a liver laceration that is not fully healed. If you leave now, you risk sepsis, internal bleeding and death, in roughly that order." Marco looked up at her, and whatever fury had consumed him the night before had settled, overnight, into something quieter and more resolved. "Then I need you to bring him here, to me. I can't wait any longer, Elena. Every hour that passes is another hour I don't know my own son." "You can't just— Marco, he's 9 years old. You can't spring a stranger on him in a hospital room, especially not a stranger with armed guards outside the door."
"Then tell me how you want to do it," Marco said, and something in his voice made her realize with a jolt that he was genuinely asking, not commanding, not threatening, simply asking, the way a father might ask a mother for guidance on the one subject in the world where he had absolutely no experience. "I have run a criminal empire since I was 26 years old, Elena. I have never once, not for a single day, been a father. Tell me what he needs. Tell me how to do this right." Elena stood very still, studying his face, and found herself, despite everything, despite 10 years of careful distance, moved by the naked vulnerability in it. "Give me a week," she said finally. "Let me tell him first, without you in the room. Let him ask his questions, get angry, get confused, all of it, without an audience.
"And then, if he wants to, I'll bring him to meet you, somewhere neutral. Not a hospital, not with guards standing outside the door like he's under arrest." Marco was quiet for a moment, and she watched him fight the instinct, clearly a lifetime's habit, to simply take control of the situation and make it happen on his own terms. "A week," he agreed finally. "But Elena, I want you to understand something. I am not going anywhere. Not this time. I don't care what it costs me. I don't care what I have to dismantle or rebuild in my own life to make room for this. I am going to be his father, starting now, for the rest of his life. That is not a threat. It's a promise. And I have never once broken a promise to you." Elena looked at him for a long moment and felt, against every defense she had built over 10 years, something in her chest crack open.
"I know," she said quietly. "That's what terrifies me." She told him on a Saturday. They sat together on the small balcony of their apartment, Dante's favourite spot, where he liked to eat cereal in the mornings and watch the pigeons argue over the neighbour's fire escape. And Elena held his hands in hers and told him, in the careful, age-appropriate language she had rehearsed 100 times in the mirror, that his father was alive, that his father had never known he existed, and that his father wanted, very much, to meet him. Dante was quiet for a long time, longer than she expected, his small face working through something far too complicated for a 9-year-old to have earned the right to feel. "You told me he was gone," he said finally. "You said he wasn't in the picture."
"I know, baby, I'm sorry. I thought—" Elena's voice caught. "I thought I was protecting you. I believed something about your father that turned out to be wrong, and I was so scared of what might happen if I was wrong about being scared that I never let you have the chance to know him." Is he a bad guy? Dante's eyes, so like his father's, fixed on her with a directness that made her chest ache. Like in movies, is my dad a bad guy? Elena thought carefully before she answered, because she owed her son the truth, or as much of it as a 9-year-old could hold. Your dad is a complicated man, Dante. He's done things I don't agree with, things that are dangerous, and his world is not a safe world in a lot of ways. But he did not do the thing I believed he did for 10 years. And from everything I've seen this week, he wants nothing more than to know you and to keep you safe. Does he look like me? Something in the question, so small, so achingly hopeful, broke Elena's heart clean in half. Yes, she said, you have his exact jaw. And when you're concentrating really hard on something, you get this little line right here. She touched his forehead gently. And he does that too, exactly the same. Dante was quiet again, processing, and then he asked the question Elena had been dreading most of all. Does he have a family? Like other kids? No, sweetheart. As far as I know, it's just been him, alone, for a long time. Like us, Dante said quietly. It's been just us for a long time too. Elena pulled her son into her arms and held him, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, the weight of 9 secret years settling between them like something finally set down after being carried too long. Do you want to meet him? She asked, finally, into his hair. Dante pulled back, and his face, so young, so brave, settled into an expression of careful, deliberate courage that reminded her, with a pang, of exactly how his father must have looked at 9 years old, already learning to carry more than a child should. Yeah, he said. I want to meet my dad. They met 3 days later, not at the Vitale compound, not at the hospital, but at a small park near the lake that Elena had chosen specifically for its neutrality. Open, public, unremarkable. A place where Marco Vitale, still moving carefully from his surgery, still guarded discreetly by 2 men who kept a respectful 50 yards distance, could simply be a man on a bench, waiting. Elena saw him first from across the playground, sitting very still, hands clasped between his knees, wearing an expression she had never once seen on him in 2 years of loving him and 1 week of hating him again. Pure, unguarded terror. Is that him? Dante asked, small hand tightening in hers. That's him. They crossed the grass together, and Marco stood as they approached, and for one long, suspended moment, father and son simply looked at each other, Marco cataloguing every feature of the boy in front of him with an expression of such naked wonder that Elena had to look away, and Dante studying the tall, dark-haired stranger with the same careful, assessing stillness his father had used on Elena herself in an ER 10 years and a lifetime ago. Hi, Dante said, finally, breaking the silence with the blunt courage of a child. I'm Dante. Marco crouched down, slowly, carefully, his hand pressing briefly to his side where the drain had only just been removed, until he was at eye level with his son, and when he spoke, his voice was rougher than Elena had ever heard it, even bleeding out on her table. I know, he said. I've known your name for exactly 1 week, and it's already my favourite word. Dante studied him for a moment longer, and then, with the particular directness only children possess, asked, Are you a mob boss? Elena's breath caught. Marco, to his enormous credit, did not flinch. I run a family business, he said carefully,
holding the boy's gaze with total seriousness, refusing to lie to him even in this first, fragile moment. "It's not always a good business, Dante. There are things about my life I am not proud of, and things I have done to protect the people I love that I hope you never have to do yourself. But I want you to know something, and I need you to believe me, even though we just met. Nothing in this world matters more to me than you and your mother. Nothing. Not power, not money, not any of it. I would burn all of it down tomorrow if it meant keeping you safe." Dante considered this with the grave seriousness of a 9-year-old weighing evidence. And then, unexpectedly, he smiled. A small, uncertain smile, but a real one. The gap in his teeth long since grown in, but the grin the same as the one in the photograph that had started all of this. "Okay," Dante said. "Do you want to see my drawing? I made one of a wolf. It's my favourite animal because they protect their family." Marco's face, in that moment, did something Elena had never once seen it do in 2 years of loving him. It came completely, helplessly undone. "Yes," he said, his voice thick. "I would like that. Very much." The weeks that followed took on a shape Elena had never expected to live inside. Something that looked, from the outside, almost like a family. Marco, discharged from the hospital and healing steadily under Elena's own watchful professional eye, threw himself into fatherhood with the same terrifying focus he had once applied to building an empire. He learned Dante's favourite foods, his favourite books, the exact way he liked his pancakes cut into triangles instead of squares. He showed up to a school science fair with 2 bodyguards discreetly stationed at the back of the gymnasium, and looked, watching his son explain a baking soda volcano with fierce 9-year-old pride, more moved than Elena had ever seen him at the head of a boardroom table controlling millions of dollars. And slowly, carefully, something else began to rebuild itself between Elena and Marco. Not the reckless, all-consuming passion of their 20s, but something quieter and more dangerous in its own way. Trust, rebuilt one small act at a time, one dinner, one late-night phone call about a fever Dante had spiked, one moment of Marco showing up unannounced with soup because Elena had mentioned in passing that she was too tired to cook. "You don't have to keep doing this," she told him one evening, standing in her kitchen while he unpacked containers of soup from a bag with the careful attention he gave everything now, as if handling something fragile. "I want to," Marco said simply. "I missed 9 years of taking care of both of you. I'm not interested in missing any more." "Marco," Elena set down the spoon she'd been holding, "I need you to understand something. I'm grateful, more grateful than I know how to say, that you're not the man I believed you were. But that doesn't erase 10 years, and it doesn't mean I know how to just let you back in. Not after everything." "I'm not asking you to let me back in," Marco said, though the look in his eyes said otherwise, said he was asking for exactly that with every fibre of his being. "I'm asking you to let me be his father, that's all. Whatever happens between us, Elena, that's a separate question, and I can be patient about that question for as long as you need." But patience, Elena would learn, was a strategic virtue for Marco Vitale, not a natural one. She caught the way he watched her across the dinner table when he thought she wasn't looking. She felt the particular electricity that still crackled between them whenever their hands brushed passing a dish, whenever he leaned close to help Dante with a math problem and his shoulder pressed briefly against hers. 10 years had not dimmed whatever had existed between them at 24. If anything, it had deepened into something with roots, something that had survived a decade of drought and was now, impossibly, threatening to bloom again.
"You're staring," she told him one night, after Dante had gone to bed, and the two of them sat at her small kitchen table, a bottle of wine between them that neither of them had touched much. "I've spent 10 years imagining what it would look like to sit across a table from you again," Marco said, unashamed. "You'll have to forgive me if I look my fill while I have the chance." That's a very smooth line for a man who almost died 3 weeks ago. "It's not a line," his voice dropped, low and certain. "It's the truth, Elena. I have not stopped loving you for a single day of the last 10 years. I told myself I had moved on. I told myself 100 different lies to survive the loss of you. None of them were ever true." Elena's heart pounded against her ribs, old defences scrambling to hold a line that had already, she suspected, been breached weeks ago. "You can't just say things like that." "Why not?" "Because I don't know how to trust it," she said, the words tearing out of her rawer than she intended. "Because for 10 years I built a life on the certainty that loving you was the worst mistake I ever made. And now you're sitting in my kitchen telling me it wasn't. And some part of me wants so badly to believe you that it terrifies me, Marco. What if I'm wrong again? What if I let you in and it destroys everything I've built for Dante?" Marco reached across the table and took her hand. Not grasping, not possessive, simply holding, the way he might hold something he'd been told was made of glass. "Then we go slow," he said, "as slow as you need. I am not going anywhere, Elena. I told you that in the hospital, and I meant it. You don't have to trust me all at once. You just have to let me prove it, one day at a time, for as long as it takes." She didn't pull her hand away. That, she would think later, had been the moment she knew. Not that she trusted him completely, not yet, but that some door she had bolted shut for a decade had quietly, irrevocably come unlocked. 3 weeks into their fragile new arrangement, Marco invited Elena to a charity gala hosted at Velvet, the most exclusive nightclub in the city. A business obligation, he explained, one he could not skip even in recovery, and one he desperately wanted her beside him for. "It's not a date," he clarified, standing in her doorway in a black suit that fit him with the kind of precision only obscene wealth could buy, looking so much like the man she'd fallen in love with a decade ago that her breath caught in her throat. "It's a fundraiser, but I would very much like it to feel like one." Elena, in a dark red dress she'd bought on impulse that afternoon and hadn't fully admitted to herself was for him, let him take her hand and lead her out to a waiting car, and told herself, unconvincingly, that this was simply about co-parenting logistics. Velvet occupied the top 3 floors of a converted warehouse on the river, all exposed brick and dark glass and gold light, the kind of place where old money and dangerous money mixed freely under the guise of philanthropy. Marco moved through the crowd with the easy authority of a man who owned the room, in every sense of the word, introducing Elena to senators and shipping magnates and the occasional, visibly nervous rival, his hand resting at the small of her back, with a possessiveness that made her pulse jump every time. "You're doing that thing," she murmured to him, midway through the evening, as he steered her away from a particularly persistent city councilman. "What thing?" "The hand. The proprietary hand." Marco's mouth curved into something almost like a smile. "I'm not sorry." It was going well. Better than well, if she was honest, the evening unspooling into something almost like the easy warmth they'd once had, until a woman in emerald silk detached herself from a cluster of guests near the bar and made her way directly toward them, moving with the confident, territorial grace of someone who considered the room, and possibly the man in it, her own. "Marco." The woman's voice was warm, familiar, entirely too familiar for Elena's comfort. "I heard about the accident. I've been trying to reach you for weeks." "Sophia." Marco's voice cooled several degrees, and his hand at Elena's back tightened fractionally. "I've been recovering and occupied." Sophia's eyes moved to Elena with a slow, assessing sweep that made Elena's spine straighten. "You must be the doctor, the one who's been keeping him so occupied." The word landed with deliberate, delicate cruelty. "I'm Sophia Moretti. Marco and I go back a long way. We were nearly engaged before he decided monogamy wasn't for him." Elena felt the name land like a stone dropped in still water. Moretti. The same family that had ordered her brother's death. "That's a generous interpretation of events," Marco said, his voice gone flat and dangerous. "We dated for 6 months, 4 years ago, and I ended it because you were more interested in what my family could do for yours than in me. Elena, this is Sophia Moretti. Her father is Salvatore Moretti." The name detonated something in Elena's chest. She kept her face carefully neutral through sheer force of will, though every muscle in her body had gone rigid. "Charmed," Sophia said, with a smile that suggested the opposite, and then turning back to Marco with a proprietary tilt of her head that made Elena's jealousy flare, hot and unwelcome. "You should call me sometime, Marco, for old time's sake. I heard you have a son now. Quite the surprise after everything." "How did you hear that?" Marco said very quietly, and something in his voice made the temperature of the entire conversation drop. Sophia's smile didn't waver, but something calculating moved behind her eyes. "Word travels, darling. In our world, secrets have a very short shelf life." She let her gaze linger on Eleanor one final assessing moment before turning and melting back into the crowd, leaving behind her a silence thick with implication. "Marco," Eleanor said, low and urgent, the moment Sophia was out of earshot. "How does a Moretti know about Dante? We told almost no one." Marco's face had gone hard, calculating, every trace of the warm man from an hour ago replaced by the cold, dangerous strategist she had first fallen for a decade ago, the man she'd spent years believing capable of murder. "I don't know," he said, "but I intend to find out tonight." He signalled discreetly to one of his men across the room, a subtle shift of his hand that Elena would not have caught if she hadn't spent the last week learning the language of his silent gestures. "Elena, I need you to trust me on something. I want you and Dante somewhere secure tonight. Not your apartment, somewhere with real security." "Marco, you're scaring me." "Good," he said, and his eyes, when they found hers, held a fierce, protective intensity that made her breath catch. "Because for the first time in 10 years, I have something in this world I am terrified of losing, and I am not going to take a single chance with either of your lives. Not one." Elena did not sleep at her apartment that night. By 11 p.m., and she and Dante, roused gently from sleep, confused but obedient in the way children are when they sense adult fear beneath careful reassurances, were installed in a guest suite of Marco's penthouse, 40 floors above the city,
surrounded by more security than Elena had known existed outside of federal buildings. Dominic stood in the hallway, speaking in low, urgent Italian into a phone, while Marco paced the length of his study like a man barely restraining a violence Elena had never personally witnessed, but had always, somewhere beneath her grief, believed him capable of. "Tell me what's happening," Elena said, closing the study door behind her once Dante was settled, asleep again within minutes with the resilience only children possess.
Sophia Moretti knew about Dante, Marco said, not turning from the window, his silhouette hard against the glittering skyline. That information did not come from anywhere public. I have kept his existence contained to a handful of people I trust completely, which means either someone close to me is talking, or the Morettis have found a way to watch us that I haven't identified yet. You think they'd hurt him? It wasn't a question. 10 years of running from exactly this fear had left Elena fluent in its particular grammar. I think Salvatore Moretti has spent 10 years believing my family got away with something his family did, Marco said, finally turning to face her, his expression carved from stone. I think if he learns I have a son, an heir, a weakness, a piece of leverage he's never had before, he will not hesitate for a single second to use that against me. I am not going to give him the opportunity. How do we stop it? We don't, Marco said. I do. This is my world, Elena, and I know exactly how to protect what's mine in it. I need you to trust me with this, the way you're learning to trust me with everything else. Elena crossed the room and stood in front of him, close enough to feel the tension radiating off his body like heat. I've spent 9 years being the only person who protected that boy. I'm not going to start standing on the sidelines now just because your world has different rules than mine. Something in Marco's face softened, just slightly, at the fierceness in her voice. The same fierceness, she suspected, that had first drawn him to her in an ER a decade ago. A woman who had never once in her life waited passively for a man to save her. I'm not asking you to stand on the sidelines, he said. I'm asking you to let me be the wall between our son and anyone who would use him against me. That's not weakness, Eleanor. That's what a father does. He reached up, brushed a strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the coiled violence still humming just beneath his surface. I have spent 10 years grieving everything I lost in one night in Red Hook. I am not going to lose either of you to the same world that took your brother. I would burn the entire Moretti family to the ground first. Marco, I mean that literally, he said, quiet and absolute. And something in his eyes made Eleanor believe, with a chill, exactly how literally he meant it. She should have been afraid of that. Some part of her, the part that had run from him a decade ago, certain he was a monster, still recoiled instinctively from the cold, absolute violence coiled beneath his words. But a larger part of her, standing in his study 40 floors above the city, with her son asleep safely down the hall, felt something else entirely. The profound, dangerous relief of no longer being the only one standing guard. What do we do now? She asked. Now, Marco said, you and Dante stay here, where I can keep you safe, and I make some calls. He kissed her then, suddenly, fiercely, with none of the careful patience he'd shown for weeks, as if the threat to their son had finally cracked open every restraint he'd been holding since the hospital. Elena kissed him back with equal desperation. 10 years of grief and longing and unresolved love finally breaking loose all at once, her hands fisting in the front of his shirt as if she could hold the entire fragile architecture of their reunion together by sheer force of will. "Stay," Marco murmured against her mouth when they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard. "Tonight, stay with me." Elena looked into the eyes of the man she had spent a decade hating for a crime he hadn't committed, the father of her son, the only man who had ever made her feel simultaneously the safest and the most reckless she had ever been in her life, and made a decision that felt less like surrender and more like coming home. "Okay," she whispered. "Yes." 2 floors below the penthouse, in a service corridor accessible only by a key card that should not have existed outside a very short list of trusted employees, a man in a maintenance uniform stood with his phone pressed to his ear, speaking in a low, urgent whisper. "She's here," he said. "The doctor. The kid, too. Vitali's got them locked up tight in the penthouse, more security than I've ever seen him run." On the other end of the line, Salvatore Moretti's voice was smooth and satisfied, the voice of a man who had waited 10 years for a piece of information exactly this valuable to finally fall into his lap. "A son," Salvatore said. "After everything, Marco Vitale has a son, and he never even knew it. Does he know you're inside his organization?" "No, sir. I've been careful." 6 years, and he's never once suspected me." "Good. Keep it that way." A pause, contemplative, calculating. "Tell me something. Does he know yet about what happened to the girl's brother? Does he know the truth about that night?" "I don't know, sir, but the doctor's been treating him for weeks. If anyone was going to dig into the past, it'd be her." Salvatore was quiet for a long moment. "Then it's time to move faster than I'd planned. If Marco Vitale learns the full truth of what happened in Red Hook, not the partial truth he's operated on for 10 years, but everything, it will not just cost me a business rival. It will cost me my life. Marco does not forgive men who use his own weaknesses against him. And I have been sitting inside his organization's blind spot for 6 years, feeding him just enough truth to keep him from looking any closer." "What do you want me to do?" "Watch them," Salvatore said. "Watch all 3 of them closely and report back everything. And prepare a contingency. If Marco gets too close to the truth, we may need to remind him just how much he stands to lose by pursuing it." Upstairs, unaware of the conversation unfolding 2 floors beneath him, Marco sat in the dark of his bedroom hours later, Elena asleep against his chest for the first time in a decade, and allowed himself for one dangerous, unguarded hour to simply feel happy. It didn't last. His phone buzzed against the nightstand at just past 3 a.m. Dominic. And Dominic did not call at 3 a.m. unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. Marco slid carefully out from beneath Elena, who stirred but did not wake, and stepped into the hallway to take the call. "Talk to me," he said quietly. "Boss." Dominic's voice was tight, urgent, carrying the particular strain of a man delivering news he knew would detonate something. "I pulled the personnel files, cross-referenced with the timeline you asked about. Who could have known about the boy? I think we have a problem that goes back further than tonight." "Explain." "Enzo Ricci," Dominic said, "the soldier who pulled the trigger on Sal Rossi. He didn't die in a prison fight, boss.
That was a cover story. I just found the real intake and transfer records. He was released 18 months after his sentencing began. Someone got him out. Someone with real reach inside the state system. Marco felt something cold and terrible settle in his chest. Who signed the release? That's the thing, boss.
Dominic's voice dropped even lower. The paperwork traces back through 3 shell layers, but underneath all of it, it's one of ours. It's someone inside our own organization. Someone who's had access to your operations for years. Marco closed his eyes, feeling the floor of his careful, rebuilt world begin once again to shift beneath him. Give me a name, Dominic. I need another day to confirm it completely. But boss, the trail points to someone very close to you. Someone you'd never suspect. Marco stood alone in the dark hallway of his own penthouse, his sleeping son down one corridor, the woman he loved asleep in his bed down another, and understood, with the particular clarity that only comes at 3 in the morning, that the truth he had spent 10 years believing he already possessed was about to reveal itself as only half the story.
Find him, Marco said. Whoever it is, find him before the Morettis find a way to use what he knows against my family. He hung up the phone and stood very still in the darkness. And for the first time since Elena had walked back into his life, Marco Vitale felt genuinely afraid. Elena woke to an empty bed and the low murmur of tense voices from the study down the hall. She found Marco and Dominic hunched over a laptop, the atmosphere in the room thick with a tension she recognized instantly from a decade of emergency rooms. The particular quiet of men trying to control a crisis before it could fully detonate. "What's happened?" she asked, drawing her robe tighter around herself. Marco looked up, and the expression on his face made her stomach drop.
Someone inside my organization arranged Enzo Ricci's early release from prison. Someone with real access, real authority. I need you to sit down, Eleanor, because what I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear. Just tell me. Dominic traced the paperwork, Marco said carefully. It leads back to Antonio. Elena's breath caught. Antonio Vitale, Marco's uncle, his father's younger brother, the man who had served as underboss to 2 generations of Vitale leadership, the man who had walked Elena down an aisle at a cousin's wedding a decade ago and told her, with what she'd believed was genuine warmth, that he'd never seen Marco happier than when she was in the room. "Your uncle," she said slowly. "Your own uncle arranged for Sal's killer to be released early." "It's worse than that," Dominic said quietly, and Marco's jaw tightened as if bracing for a blow. "Boss, I kept digging after I called you last night. The shell companies that arranged the release, they're the same entities that funneled certain irregular payments through the organization 10 years ago, right around the time of the Red Hook incident." "Say it," Marco said, his voice gone flat and dangerous. "I think Antonio ordered the leak that led the Morettis to your brother's investigation," Dominic said to Elena, his voice careful, clinical, the voice of a man delivering a diagnosis he wished he could take back. "I think he's been playing both sides for over a decade, feeding information to Salvatore Moretti, taking a cut of profits from operations he was supposed to be protecting, and using Enzo Ricci as the instrument to eliminate a cop who was getting too close to exposing the whole arrangement. Sal Rossi wasn't collateral damage in a Moretti power play, Elena. I think your brother was killed because Antonio needed him silenced, and the Morettis were simply the hired hand. The room tilted. Elena gripped the back of a chair to steady herself, 10 years of grief reorganizing itself around a truth even more devastating than the one she'd spent a decade believing. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would he do that to his own family?" "Money," Marco said, his voice a low, controlled fury that frightened her more than shouting ever could. "Power. Antonio has spent 30 years standing one step behind my father and one step behind me, watching us run an empire he believed should have been his. I don't know the full arrangement yet, but I intend to find out today." "Marco." Elena crossed to him, laid a hand on his arm, feeling the coiled violence trembling just beneath his skin. "What are you going to do?" "What I should have done 10 years ago, if I'd had the information," Marco said, and the coldness in his voice was the coldness she remembered fearing most a decade ago, before she'd learned it was armor rather than the man himself. "I'm going to find out the truth, completely, and then I am going to make sure Antonio Vitale never has the opportunity to hurt this family again." "Marco, listen to me." Elena's grip on his arm tightened. "You almost died 3 weeks ago. You have a 9-year-old son who just met you and needs you alive, not locked up or dead in some war with your own family. Whatever you're planning, do it carefully, do it smart. Don't let 10 years of grief turn you into someone Dante has to grow up afraid of." Something in Marco's face cracked at that, the fury tempering into something more careful, more controlled. "You're right," he said quietly. "I won't do anything reckless. But Elena, I need you to understand that Antonio betrayed this family in the worst possible way. He is responsible, directly or indirectly, for your brother's death. He cannot simply be forgiven and welcomed back to Sunday dinner." "I'm not asking you to forgive him," Elena said. "I'm asking you to be smart about how you make him answer for it." Dominic cleared his throat carefully. "Boss, there's one more thing. If Antonio's been working with Salvatore Moretti for this long, and Salvatore's people already know about Dante, we need to assume Antonio knows too. Which means the danger to your son isn't hypothetical anymore. It's already here." Marco's face went white, with a fury so absolute it was almost silent, and Elena watched the last of his careful restraint burn away into something that looked terrifyingly like the cold, dangerous man she had once been so certain was capable of murder. "Then we move. Today," Marco said, "before either of them has the chance to touch my son." Marco called a family meeting for that evening, a gathering of the Vitale organization's senior members at the compound in the suburbs, ostensibly to discuss quarterly business, a routine he had maintained for years and one Antonio would have no reason to suspect. Elena watched him prepare for it with a controlled, focused calm that reminded her, unsettlingly, of watching herself prepare for a difficult surgery. The same compartmentalization, the same ruthless narrowing of attention onto the single task at hand. "I don't like this," she told him, standing in the doorway of his bedroom as he adjusted his cufflinks in the mirror. "You're walking into a room with the man who had my brother killed, and you're doing it calmly, like it's a board meeting." "That's exactly what it has to look like," Marco said. "If Antonio suspects for 1 second that I know the truth, he'll disappear.
Or worse, he'll move against Dante before I have the chance to protect him. I need him to believe everything is normal until the moment it isn't. And then what? Marco met her eyes in the mirror, and for a moment the coldness dropped away entirely, revealing the man underneath it, frightened, determined, utterly focused on the two people who had, in the span of a month, become the only things in his life that mattered. And then I make sure he never has the opportunity to hurt this family again. Legally, if I can manage it. There's enough evidence now to hand to federal prosecutors that would put him away for the rest of his life without me lifting a finger. I'd rather see him rot in a cell than become a martyr who makes my organization look weak. And if legal isn't an option? Marco didn't answer that. He didn't need to. Elena spent the evening at the penthouse with Dante, the two of them working through a jigsaw puzzle at the kitchen island, while four of Marco's most trusted men stood watch throughout the apartment, and tried not to let her son see how frightened she was. "Is Dad going to be okay?" Dante asked, halfway through the puzzle, with the unsettling perceptiveness children sometimes possess for the emotional weather around them. "He's going to be fine," Elena said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "He's just handling some grown-up business tonight." "Is it dangerous?" Elena considered lying, the way she had lied to protect him for 9 years, and found, for the first time, that she didn't want to. "Sometimes your dad's work is dangerous," she said carefully. "But he's very good at what he does, and he has people who protect him, and he loves you and me more than anything in the world. That's not going to change." Dante nodded slowly, fitting a puzzle piece into place with the same careful concentration his father brought to everything, and said nothing more about it, though Elena noticed him glancing toward the window every few minutes for the rest of the evening, watching the lights of the city as if he might somehow catch sight of his father's safety in them. The meeting at the compound proceeded exactly as Marco had planned, for the first 40 minutes. Antonio arrived exactly on time, greeted his nephew with the same warm, avuncular affection he had always shown, and settled into the quarterly reports with every appearance of a man with nothing to hide. It was only when Marco set a single manila folder on the table, unopened, deliberate, that something shifted in Antonio's carefully composed expression. "What's this?" Antonio asked, his voice still light, though something guarded had crept into his eyes. "Enzo Ricci's release paperwork," Marco said, not opening the folder, letting the name land in the silence like a dropped weight. "Along with about a decade of shell company transactions that I think you're going to find very familiar." The colour drained from Antonio's face by careful degrees. "Marco." "I want to hear you say it," Marco said, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees with the quiet, absolute authority in his voice. "I want to hear you explain to me, Uncle, exactly why you arranged for the man who murdered Sal Rossi to walk free 18 months into his sentence. And I want you to explain why you've spent 10 years feeding information to Salvatore Moretti while sitting at my right hand pretending to be loyal." The room had gone utterly silent, every man at the table understanding, with the particular instinct of men who had spent their lives in dangerous rooms, that they were witnessing the exact moment an empire's foundation cracked. Antonio's hands, resting on the table, had begun almost imperceptibly to shake. "You don't understand," Antonio said quietly. "Everything I did to protect this family." "You destroyed a woman's brother," Marco said, his voice a low, controlled fire. You cost me 10 years with the woman I love, and 9 years with a son I never knew existed. Explain to me, uncle, exactly how any of that protected this family.
Your father was going to hand the business to your cousin Franco, Antonio said, and his voice, once so warm and paternal, had gone brittle and defensive. Did you know that? Before Franco died in that car accident, everyone was so quick to call a tragedy. Your father had already decided the leadership would skip me entirely and go straight to the next generation. I had given this family 35 years of my life, Marco. 35 years standing exactly one step behind, and I was going to be passed over for a nephew barely out of his 20s. So you made a deal with Salvatore Moretti, Marco said, disgust thick in his voice. I made an arrangement that guaranteed my position regardless of what your father decided, Antonio said. A percentage of certain shipments in exchange for information that kept his operations safe from federal attention, information he needed to protect his own family's interests. It was business, Marco. It has always only ever been business. And Sal Rossi? Antonio's jaw tightened. Rossi's investigation was going to expose the arrangement between our organizations. If it went public, it would have destroyed everything I'd built with Salvatore and possibly implicated me directly. I gave Salvatore the information about Rossi's source. What Salvatore did with that information, ordering the hit, using Enzo Ricci, that decision was his, not mine. But you knew, Elena's voice, quiet and lethal, cut through the room. Elena, who had insisted on being present, standing in the doorway where she had slipped in unnoticed during the heat of the confrontation, her eyes fixed on the man who had destroyed her family for the sake of a promotion. You knew what would happen to my brother, and you handed him over anyway. Antonio turned, startled, some of his composure finally fully collapsing at the sight of her. Elena, I am so sorry. I never wanted— Don't, Elena said, her voice shaking with a fury she had carried, misdirected, for 10 years, finally finding its true target. Don't you dare tell me you're sorry. My brother bled to death on a warehouse floor because you wanted a bigger piece of a criminal empire. I have spent 10 years hating the wrong man, Antonio. I have spent 10 years keeping my son from his father because I believed Marco was capable of ordering that murder, when the entire time it was you, sitting at family dinners, walking me down the aisle at a wedding, holding my brother's own nephew as a baby at his own goddamn christening. Her voice broke. It was you, the entire time. The silence that followed was absolute. And the release, Marco said finally, his voice a low, dangerous quiet that made every man in the room go very still. Enzo Ricci. Why free the man who pulled the trigger? Insurance, Antonio said, defeated now, all pretense gone. Salvatore wanted him out. A loyalty payment, proof his organization protected its own. I arranged it through channels that would never trace back to either of us. I didn't expect— He stopped. You didn't expect what? Marco pressed. I didn't expect Ricci to talk, Antonio admitted. He got out, got drunk, started bragging in the wrong bar about a job he'd done for the Morettis a few years back. Word started moving. I had him handled before it could reach you. Handled, Marco repeated, his voice ice. He's dead, Marco. Has been for 2 years. The prison fight story was mine. I arranged that too, to close the loop cleanly. Antonio's hands were shaking openly now.
Everything I did to protect this family from exposure. To protect you in a way you'll never do not, Marco said, standing slowly, every line of his body coiled with a violence he was visibly, ferociously restraining. Finish that sentence by pretending any part of what you did was for me.
You let a woman I loved believe I was a murderer for 10 years. You let my son grow up without a father. You had an innocent man killed, and you had his killer killed to cover your own tracks. And you have sat across from me at 100 family dinners since, smiling, while I grieved a version of the truth you built specifically to survive. Marco turned to Dominic, his voice dropping into the flat, absolute register of a man who had already made his decision. Take him. Federal prosecutors have wanted a case against the Moretti organization for a decade. They'll want this even more. And Antonio is going to give them everything, in exchange for the only mercy I'm willing to offer him. His life. In a cell, instead of at the bottom of the river, where every part of me wants to put him tonight.
Marco, Antonio started. You're fortunate, Marco said, that I have a son now who needs to grow up believing his father chose justice over vengeance, even when vengeance was the only thing I wanted. That is the only reason you're walking out of this room alive. As two of Marco's men moved to flank Antonio, the older man's eyes found Elena's one final time, and something in his expression, not quite remorse, but something close to it, made her chest ache despite everything. I am sorry, Elena, Antonio said quietly, as he was led from the room. For whatever it's worth, I truly am. Elena said nothing at all. There was nothing left to say to the man who had cost her brother's life, and 10 years of her own.
The days that followed Antonio's exposure moved with the strange, suspended quality of the aftermath of any great storm, the world reassembling itself into a new shape, while everyone inside it struggled to adjust to the altered landscape. Federal prosecutors, delighted with the evidence Marco's organization handed them, moved quickly against both Antonio and the crumbling remains of the Moretti operation, whose finances and personnel structure Antonio's decade of documentation exposed in devastating detail. Salvatore Moretti himself, facing a mounting federal case and the sudden, catastrophic loss of his inside source within the Vitale organization, went to ground, his empire beginning the slow, inevitable collapse that follows any criminal enterprise once its foundations of secrecy have been cracked open to daylight. Marco should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt, for the first time in a decade, something closer to grief, laid finally, fully to rest. I keep thinking about the 10 years we lost, he told Elena one evening, the two of them sitting on the balcony of his penthouse while Dante slept inside, the city glittering below them in a way that had once, long ago, felt like the whole world laid out at their feet. I keep doing the math. Birthdays, Christmases, the first time he walked, the first time he talked, all of it, gone, and I can never get any of it back. I know, Elena said softly, and reached for his hand. I think about it too, every day. Do you regret it? Marco asked. Leaving, keeping him from me? If you could go back. I don't know, Elena admitted, because she owed him honesty now, above everything else. I believed I was protecting him. I believed it with my whole heart, and I would make the same choice again with the information I had at the time. But knowing what I know now, a voice caught. Yes, I regret it.
I regret every year you didn't get to hold him, every year he grew up without a father who would have burned the world down for him. I'm sorry, Marco. I know that's not enough, but I am. Marco turned to look at her, and the intensity in his expression, the same intensity that had first drawn her to him a decade ago, the intensity of a man who had never once in his life loved anything by half measures, settled over his face like something finally, fully resolved. I don't want an apology, he said. I want a future. I have spent 10 years grieving the past, Elena, and I am done. I want to know if there's a version of this, of us, that exists going forward. Not because of Dante, because of you. Because I have never once, in 10 years, stopped being in love with you. And now that I have you back in my life, I refuse to let you go again without a fight. Elena's breath caught. Marco. I'm not asking you to decide tonight, he said, his voice gentling. I'm asking you to let me try. Let me court you properly, the way I should have 10 years ago before everything fell apart. Let me prove to you, day by day, that whatever I am, whatever this world has made me, I am, above everything else, a man who loves you completely and would spend the rest of his life proving it, if you'd let me.
Elena looked at him for a long moment, at the hard, beautiful face she had loved at 24 and hated for a decade, and was, impossibly, falling in love with all over again, and felt the last of her careful defences finally, fully give way. Okay, she said quietly. Court me, Marco Vitali. I dare you to try. Something in his face broke open into a smile so rare, so genuinely happy, that she felt it land in her chest like sunlight. Careful, he murmured, drawing her closer. I don't lose challenges. I remember, Elena said, and let him kiss her, slow and certain, on a balcony 40 floors above a city that had once torn them apart and was now, finally, giving them back to each other.
But even as the danger from Antonio and the Morettis receded into legal proceedings and federal custody, a smaller, quieter danger remained unresolved, one neither Elena nor Marco fully registered until it was almost too late. Sofia Moretti, watching her father's empire collapse around her, watching the man she had once hoped to marry build a family with another woman entirely, did not take her losses gracefully. And 3 nights after Marco and Elena shared their kiss on the balcony, Sofia made a phone call of her own, not to her father, whose usefulness to her had ended along with his empire, but to a private investigator she had used before, one skilled in exactly the kind of quiet, devastating leverage a desperate woman with old grudges and new information might need. I want everything on Dr. Elena Rossi, Sofia said. Where she goes, who she trusts, and specifically, I want to know her son's school schedule. The call came in at 2:14 in the afternoon, while Elena was mid-suture on a trauma patient 3 floors up from the ICU, where she had first found Marco bleeding out 5 weeks earlier. Dr. Rossi? Marisol's voice, breaking into the sterile quiet of the OR through the intercom, carried a tension that made every hand in the room still. I'm sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this immediately. It's about your son's school. Elena's hands did not shake, could not shake, not with a patient's abdomen open beneath them, but something cold dropped through her chest, like a stone through still water. Finish the closure, she told her resident, stripping off her gloves with hands that betrayed nothing while her mind screamed.
I need to step out for exactly 2 minutes. The message waiting for her on her phone was from Dante's school, sent 40 minutes earlier, and somehow, in the chaos of the OR, unnoticed until now. Mrs. Alvarez arrived to pick up Dante at the scheduled time, but records show he was already checked out 20 minutes prior by an individual claiming to be a family member. Please contact the office immediately to confirm. Elena's world went white at the edges. She called Marco before she had even finished reading the message a second time, her hands finally fully shaking now, her voice barely holding together as the phone rang once, twice. Elena?
They took him. The words tore out of her, raw and broken. Marco, someone took Dante from school. Someone claiming to be family checked him out 20 minutes before Mrs. Alvarez arrived, and nobody at the school called to verify because... Her voice broke completely. Marco, our son is missing. The silence on the other end of the line lasted less than 2 seconds, but in it, Elena heard something in Marco Vitale transform entirely, heard the father dissolve instantly and completely into the man who had built and defended a criminal empire for over a decade, a man whose ruthlessness she had once feared and now, in this single terrible moment, prayed for with her whole soul. I'm on my way to you, Marco said, his voice gone flat, absolute, terrifyingly calm. Dominic is already pulling every camera within 6 blocks of that school. Elena, listen to me very carefully. I need you to think. Who else knew Dante's school schedule? Who else could have known exactly when to make this move? Elena's mind raced backward through the last few weeks, through every conversation, every person who had learned, recently, about her son's existence, and landed, with sickening clarity, on a single name. Sophia, she whispered. Marco. Sophia Moretti knew about him before anyone. At the gala, she said word travels fast. I'll have her located within the hour, Marco said, and something in his voice made Elena believe him absolutely. Elena, I need you to trust me completely right now. I know this world. I know exactly how to move through it faster and more ruthlessly than anyone trying to hurt what's mine. I am going to find our son, and I am going to bring him home to you tonight. Do you understand me? Marco, if they hurt him, they won't, Marco said, and the certainty in his voice was absolute, unshakable. The voice of a man who had spent his entire life ensuring that his word, once given, was never broken. Because I am about to become the most dangerous version of myself that has existed in 10 years, Eleanor, and every single person in this city who might know where my son is will understand, within the hour, exactly what happens to people who touch what belongs to Marco Vitale. He hung up before she could respond, and Eleanor stood alone in the hospital corridor, one hand braced against the wall, and did something she had not allowed herself to do in 10 years of careful, controlled composure. She prayed, not to any particular god, not with any particular faith, but with the raw, desperate ferocity of a mother whose child had been taken from her. That the man she had spent a decade hating and was now, impossibly, trusting with everything she had left in the world, would keep the promise he had just made. Behind her, unnoticed in the chaos, her phone buzzed with a single text message from an unknown number. Your son is safe, for now. Tell Marco to stop digging into things that don't concern him anymore, or the next call won't be this polite.
Eleanor's blood ran to ice, and she ran, full speed, badge flying, coat abandoned somewhere behind her, for the parking garage, dialing Marco with hands that would not stop shaking, praying she would reach him before whoever held her son decided politeness was no longer required. Marco read the text message Elena forwarded him 3 times, his face carved from something colder and harder than anything Elena had witnessed in 5 weeks of watching him rebuild himself into a father. And then he did something that terrified her more than any threat could. He went completely, unnervingly calm. "They want me to stop digging," he said quietly, standing in the centre of his study, surrounded by 6 of his most trusted men, each of them awaiting instruction with the tense readiness of soldiers who understood exactly what was at stake. "Which means they're afraid of what I'll find. Which means this isn't really about Sophia's jealousy anymore. This is about someone who's afraid Antonio told me more than he actually did." "Boss," Dominic said, stepping forward with a tablet in hand, "we've got him." Traffic camera 2 blocks from the school caught the vehicle, black SUV, plates registered to a shell company we've already flagged as connected to Salvatore Moretti's remaining assets. "We're tracking it now." "Salvatore," Marco said, "not Sophia." "Sophia knew the information," Dominic said, "but moving a child requires resources Sophia doesn't have on her own anymore, not with her father's operation collapsing. I think she made a call to Daddy, and Daddy saw an opportunity to buy himself leverage before the federal case closes in." Marco's jaw tightened. "Where's the vehicle now?" "Heading toward the old shipping terminal on the south side. It's Moretti territory, boss, always has been. If they're taking him there, then that's where we're going." Marco was already moving, already checking the weapon holstered beneath his jacket with the same terrifying competence Elena had glimpsed once before, on the hospital bed, in the brief moment before anesthesia had pulled him under. "Elena." "I'm coming," Elena said, before he could finish the sentence, her voice absolute, unshakable. "That's my son, Marco. I am not sitting in a penthouse waiting for a phone call. Elena, this is not a hospital. This is not a world where your training keeps you safe. If something goes wrong, you'll want a trauma surgeon in the room," Elena said, cutting him off with a fierceness that brooked no argument, the same fierceness that had once made him fall in love with her across an ER gurney a decade ago. "I have spent 9 years being the only person standing between that boy and every danger in this world. I am not starting to stand aside now." Marco looked at her for one long moment, torn between the desperate instinct to protect her by keeping her far from danger and the equally desperate recognition that this woman had never once, in her entire life, needed his protection more than she needed his trust. "Stay behind me," he said finally. "Every step." "I mean it, Elena." "Every step," she agreed. The shipping terminal, when they arrived 40 minutes later, under cover of the gathering dusk, sat abandoned and half-lit, a relic of an industry that had moved elsewhere decades ago, its rusted cranes standing like skeletal sentries against the darkening sky. Marco's men fanned out in careful, practiced silence, and Elena, walking half a step behind Marco, with her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs, felt the entire last decade of her life narrow down to this single, terrible moment. They found the SUV parked inside an empty warehouse bay, engine still ticking as it cooled, and beside it, flanked by 2 of Salvatore Moretti's remaining men, Salvatore himself stood waiting, with the calm, cold patience of a man who believed he still held every card in the game. And beside him, small and pale, but Elena's heart nearly stopped with relief, visibly unharmed, stood Dante, his eyes wide with fear, but his jaw set with the same stubborn courage his father had shown a decade ago in an ER bed, refusing to let anyone see him break.
"Marco," Salvatore said, spreading his hands in a gesture of false welcome. "I was starting to think you'd lost your touch. It took you longer to find us than I expected." "Let him go," Marco said, his voice flat and absolutely without mercy, every trace of the tender, patient father Elena had come to love in the last 5 weeks, replaced entirely by something ancient and terrifying. "Right now, Salvatore, or I promise you, nothing left of your organization will survive the night." Salvatore's smile didn't waver, but something calculating moved behind his eyes. "Let's discuss terms first." "There are no terms," Marco said, taking one slow, deliberate step forward, his men fanning out silently behind him in a formation Elena recognized, with a chill, as practiced and lethal. "You took a 9-year-old child from his school. There is no version of this conversation where you walk away with anything except your life, and even that is currently more generosity than you deserve." "Careful," Salvatore said, though a flicker of something uncertain crossed his face at the absolute conviction in Marco's voice. "I have 2 men on either side of your son, Marco. One wrong move, and this ends very badly for everyone." "Dad," Dante's voice, small but steady, cut across the warehouse, and Elena's heart broke and swelled simultaneously at the courage in it. "I'm okay." "I know, baby," Marco said, his voice gentling instantly, impossibly, even as every other part of him remained coiled for violence. "I'm going to bring you home, I promise." Salvatore's eyes flicked between father and son, and something calculating settled over his expression. "Touching, truly. But let's be practical, Marco. Your uncle gave the federal government everything, my finances, my personnel, 10 years of arrangements that are going to end with me spending the rest of my life in a federal facility. I have very little left to lose. Which means I am, at this exact moment, the most dangerous man in this warehouse. Because a man with nothing left to lose does not negotiate. He survives, by whatever means necessary." "What do you want?" Marco said. Though Elena could hear, underneath the flat control of his voice, the desperate calculation of a father measuring every possible outcome against his son's safety. "Immunity," Salvatore said. "Use your influence, your lawyers, your federal contacts, whatever it takes to keep me out of prison. Do that, and your son walks back to you unharmed within the hour." "I don't have that kind of influence over a federal case," Marco said. "Then find it," Salvatore said, "or watch what happens next." It was in that moment, while Salvatore's attention remained fixed entirely on Marco, while both of Salvatore's men had, in the tension of the standoff, allowed their guns to drift a few careless inches from their intended target, that Elena did something neither Marco nor Salvatore expected. She was not a soldier. She was not trained for this world of guns and leverage and calculated violence. But she was a mother and a surgeon, and she had spent 9 years learning exactly how quickly a situation could turn catastrophic in the space of a single unguarded second, and she used every ounce of that training now. "Dante!"
she called out, her voice carrying a specific, deliberate calm she had used 100 times in trauma bays to calm frightened children. "Remember what we practiced? The drop and roll game?" It was a lie. There was no game, no practiced drill. But Dante, 9 years old and sharp as his father, caught the deliberate strangeness in her voice, understood instantly that his mother was giving him an instruction disguised as nonsense, and dropped, without hesitation, flat to the concrete floor. The half-second of confusion that followed, both of Salvatore's men instinctively glancing down at the sudden movement, was all Marco needed. He moved with a speed and precision that stole the breath from Elena's lungs, closing the distance to the nearest guard before the man could fully process what had happened, disarming him with a brutal, economical violence that ended the threat in under 2 seconds. Marco's own men moved simultaneously, weapons trained on the second guard before he could raise his own, and in the sudden ringing silence that followed, only Salvatore remained standing. His earlier confidence collapsed entirely into something much closer to fear. "Dante, come to me, now," Elena called, and her son scrambled up from the floor and ran, straight into her arms, small body shaking, and Elena held him so tightly she could feel his heartbeat hammering against her own chest, both of them, finally, fully breathing again. Marco turned to Salvatore, his weapon levelled with absolute, terrible calm. 10 years of grief and 5 weeks of desperate, newfound love converging into a single decision. "Give me one reason," Marco said quietly, "not to end this exactly the way it deserves to end." Salvatore Moretti stood very still, staring down the barrel of Marco Vitale's gun, and for the first time in his life, said absolutely nothing at all. Elena, holding her son against her chest, watched Marco's face and understood, with the clarity that terrified her, that he was standing at the exact crossroads he had stood at 10 years ago, the moment when a man decides once and for all what kind of person he is going to be for the rest of his life. "Marco," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the warehouse with none of the panic she felt, only the same steady calm she had used to save his life 5 weeks earlier. "Look at me." He didn't move. "Marco," she said again more firmly, "our son is watching." Something in those words landed harder than any threat or plea could have. Marco's gaze flickered briefly to Dante, small and pale and clutching his mother, watching his father with wide, frightened eyes. And Elena watched the violence in Marco's face war visibly with something else entirely. The desperate, aching desire to be the kind of father his son could look at without fear. "I promised you once," Elena said, stepping closer, one hand still wrapped protectively around Dante's shoulders, "that I would tell him someday whether his father was a hero or a monster." "Don't make that answer for him tonight, Marco. Not like this." The silence stretched, taut and terrible, and then, slowly, Marco lowered the gun. "You're going to spend the rest of your life in a federal prison," Marco said to Salvatore, his voice still cold, still absolute, but no longer carrying the promise of immediate death. "Every asset you have left, every connection, every scrap of the empire your family built over 3 generations, gone. You will die in a cell, old and forgotten, and the last thing you will have accomplished in this world is teaching my son what happens to men who threaten a vitale." He stepped back, holstering the weapon with deliberate, controlled finality. "That is a worse punishment than a bullet, Salvatore. Living long enough to understand exactly what you lost."
Marco turned to Dominic. "Call it in. Local police, federal marshals, all of it. I want him in custody within the hour, and I want a paper trail that makes it absolutely clear this organization cooperated fully with the arrest of a man who kidnapped a child." As Dominic moved to make the calls, Marco crossed the warehouse floor to where Elena knelt with their son, and for a long moment, none of them said anything at all. Marco simply sank to his knees in front of Dante, careful of his still healing side, and pulled his son into his arms with a desperation that spoke louder than any words could have. "I was so scared," Dante said, his small voice muffled against his father's shoulder, the careful 9-year-old bravado finally cracking into something rawer and more honest. "But I remembered what Mom said, about the wolf drawing, about protecting family." "You did so well," Marco said, his voice thick, his hand cradling the back of his son's head with a gentleness that made Elena's eyes fill with tears. "You were braver than most grown men I know. I am so proud of you." He reached up, drew Elena down into the embrace as well, and for one suspended, perfect moment, the three of them knelt together on the cold concrete floor of an abandoned warehouse, finally, fully a family, while around them Marco's men secured the scene, and the distant wail of approaching sirens began to rise over the city. "Take us home," Elena said finally, her voice breaking with exhaustion and relief in equal measure. "Please, Marco, take us home." Marco stood, lifting Dante easily into his arms, despite the ache still lingering in his side, and reached back for Elena's hand. "Home," he agreed. "All three of us. Together. That's exactly where we're going." 6 months later, the penthouse that had once felt to Elena like the gilded cage of a man she was terrified to trust had transformed, slowly and completely, into something she had never expected to have again: a home. Dante's drawings covered an entire wall of Marco's study now, wolves mostly, dozens of them, along with the occasional sketch of a family of 3 standing beneath a sun with too many rays, the particular earnest artistry of a boy who had spent 9 years without a father, and was determined now to draw him into every picture. Marco had framed the first one, the very first wolf drawing Dante had shown him in the park, and hung it in a place of honour above his desk, where it looked down over boardroom calls and federal depositions and the slow, patient work of rebuilding a family business into something closer to legitimate than it had ever been in 3 generations. The Moretti organization no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Salvatore's federal trial had concluded 2 months earlier with a sentence that would keep him behind bars for the remainder of his natural life, and Sophia, facing her own charges for her role in Dante's kidnapping, had accepted a plea deal that sent her away for a decade. Long enough, Marco had noted with grim satisfaction, that she would emerge from prison to find the world she had once dominated completely, irrevocably changed without her. Antonio, too, remained in federal custody, his cooperation agreement with prosecutors the only thing standing between him and a much longer sentence.
And Marco had not visited him once, though Elena knew from the careful way he sometimes went quiet at family dinners that the betrayal still ached somewhere deep and unhealed. Some wounds, she had learned over the last 6 months, simply took longer to close than others, no matter how skilled the surgeon. But other wounds had healed beautifully, more beautifully than Elena had ever let herself hope. She stood now on the balcony where Marco had first asked her to let him court her, watching the sunset paint the city gold and rose, listening through the open door to the sound of her son's laughter as he beat his father decisively at some video game Marco had never quite mastered, despite months of determined practice, and felt something in her chest that she recognized, after 10 years of careful distance from the feeling, as simple, uncomplicated joy. "You're smiling," Marco said, appearing beside her a few minutes later, Dante's victorious laughter still audible from the living room. He slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her back against his chest, with the easy, possessive tenderness that had become as natural to them now as breathing. "I like it. I intend to be responsible for that smile as often as possible for the rest of my life." "Bold claim," Eleanor said, leaning into him. "I'm a bold man." He turned her gently to face him, and something in his expression shifted from teasing warmth into something far more serious, far more vulnerable. The same look she had seen exactly once before, in a hospital bed, 5 weeks after his accident, when he had told her he'd never stopped looking for her. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Elena's breath caught. "Marco." "I have spent 10 years grieving a life I thought I lost," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "And I have spent the last 6 months learning that the life I actually have is better than anything I ever let myself imagine. Not because the danger is gone, though I am grateful for that, but because I finally have you, and I finally have our son. And I refuse to spend one more single day pretending I want anything less than forever with both of you." He opened the box, revealing a ring, simple and elegant, nothing like the ostentatious wealth she might have expected from a man of his position, and somehow more beautiful for its restraint. "Elena Rossi, marry me. Rewrite the ending with me. The one we should have had 10 years ago, the one we're finally allowed to have now." Eleanor looked down at the ring, and then up into the face of the man she had once believed capable of murder, the man who had instead spent every single day of the last 6 months proving, with a patience and devotion she hadn't known he possessed, that he was capable of something far rarer and far more powerful. Unconditional, unwavering love. "Yes," she said, and the word came out steady, certain, 10 years of grief finally, fully transmuted into something whole. "Yes, Marco, 1,000 times yes." He kissed her then, slow and reverent, and behind them, in the doorway, Dante whooped with an unrestrained 9-year-old joy that needed no context to understand exactly what had just happened. "Does this mean I get to be in the wedding?" Dante called out, bounding onto the balcony to wrap his arms around both of them at once. "Can I bring my wolf drawings? Can there be a real wolf at the wedding?" "No wolves," Elena said, laughing through tears, pulling her son into the embrace alongside his father. "But yes to everything else, baby. Yes to all of it." Below them, the city glittered on into evening, indifferent to the small, extraordinary miracle unfolding 40 floors above its streets. A family rebuilt from the wreckage of a decade's grief. A love story, finally allowed to end the way it always should have.
and a boy who had spent 9 years without a father, now standing between both of his parents, certain, for the first time in his young life, that nothing in the world could ever separate them again. Some stories end where they begin, Elena thought, watching Marco laugh, really laugh, unguarded and easy, at something Dante said, his hand still resting warm and certain against her waist. But the best ones, the ones worth telling, are the ones brave enough to be rewritten. Theirs, finally, was one of those.